There's a specific moment in the life of a highly sensitive person when the entire architecture of their emotional world collapses. Not gradually, not gently, but with the force of sudden, crystalline clarity that rewrites everything they thought they knew about love. This moment doesn't arrive because they finally found the right person. It arrives because their nervous system can no longer sustain the lie. For years, perhaps your entire adult life, you've been running a psychological program so deeply embedded that you mistook it for personality. You believed your capacity to absorb emotional states, to attune to invisible frequencies of pain, to shape-shift around another person's needs was a gift, a calling, the very essence of who you are. But here's what the research on attachment neuroscience reveals. What you've been calling empathy is often something more complex, more tragic, and ultimately more transformative than you ever imagined. The neurobiology of emotional fusion, Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, gives us a map to understand what's actually happening in your nervous system when you feel everything. Your ventral vagal complex, the part of your autonomic nervous system responsible for social engagement, has been chronically dysregulated since childhood. You didn't develop healthy neuroception, the ability to unconsciously distinguish safety from threat in social environments. Instead, you learned to survive by becoming a sophisticated biological scanner, constantly monitoring the emotional states of others, not for connection, but for survival. This is not metaphor. This is measurable physiology. When you enter a room, your heart rate variability shifts. Your amygdala activates. Your mirror neurons fire with such intensity that you literally cannot distinguish your emotional state from the person standing next to you. Neuroscientist Marco Iacoboni's research on mirror neuron systems shows that highly empathic individuals have hyperactive simulation networks. You don't just understand others' pain, you physically recreate it in your own neural architecture. But here's the devastating truth that most empathy-focused content won't tell you. This isn't connection, it's enmeshment. And enmeshment is a trauma response, not a superpower. Jung understood this at the psychological level when he wrote about participation mystique, but modern neuroscience shows us the mechanism. Your brain never fully individuated from the collective nervous system. You're still running infant attachment programming in adult relationships, the biochemistry of relational addiction. Let's talk about what's really happening when you say you're addicted to emotionally unavailable people. Dr. Helen Fisher's neuroimaging studies on romantic love reveal that the same neural pathways activated by cocaine are activated by romantic obsession. Specifically, the ventral tegmental area floods with dopamine when you're pursuing someone who gives you intermittent reinforcement. But for the empath with early attachment trauma, there's an additional layer. Your brain has been conditioned to associate love with stress hormones. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's work on developmental trauma shows that if your childhood attachment figures were unpredictable, your brain literally wired itself to recognize the cortisol adrenaline cocktail as love. This is why calm, available people feel boring to you. Your amygdala doesn't recognize stability as safety, it recognizes it as unfamiliar, and therefore threatening. The emotionally unavailable partner who activates your hypervigilance, who requires you to constantly monitor and adjust, who creates cycles of rupture and repair. That's not love. That's your nervous system returning to its baseline state of threat-activated arousal. You're not choosing these people because you're broken. You're choosing them because your brain is trying to master an old wound by recreating it with a different ending. Spoiler, it never works. Part 3. The existential dimensions of self-abandonment, but the neuroscience only explains the mechanism. It doesn't explain the meaning. Existential psychologist Rollo May wrote about the anxiety of becoming. He understood that the journey toward authentic selfhood requires confronting what he called ontological guilt. The guilt of not living the life you were meant to live, of betraying your own potential in service of false security. For the empath, this guilt runs so deep it's become your organizing principle. You learned early that your existence was conditional, that to be tolerated, you had to be useful, that your needs were dangerous, your emotions too much, your very presence a burden unless you could justify it through service to others. So you made a Faustian bargain with existence itself. I will disappear into others so completely that no one can reject me, because there will be no me to reject. This is what Heidegger called falling, the retreat from authentic being into the comfortable inauthenticity of social roles. You became the healer, the empath, the sensitive one, and in becoming those archetypal roles, you ceased to be yourself. Jung called this identification with the persona, the mask we show the world. But for you, the mask isn't just what you show others. It's what you've shown yourself. You've been performing empathy for so long that you've forgotten it was a performance. The question that haunts you in the 3 a.m. darkness is this: if I stop performing, if I stop being useful, if I stop absorbing everyone's pain, who am I? And the terror of that question has kept you running for years. Part 4, the collapse of the false self. What finally breaks the pattern isn't insight. It's exhaustion. D.W. Winnicott described the difference between the true self and the false self. The false self is constructed entirely around compliance. It exists to manage the external world, to keep you safe through adaptation and performance. The true self, in contrast, is the spontaneous, embodied, authentic core of who you are. For decades, you've been operating entirely from false self. And the false self, no matter how sophisticated, cannot sustain itself indefinitely. It requires constant external validation, constant proof that the performance is working, constant reassurance that you won't be abandoned. Eventually, the system fails. You wake up one morning and realize you've spent 20 years in relationships where you were never actually present. You were managing, accommodating, anticipating, adjusting, but you were never there. You look in the mirror and see a stranger, someone whose preferences you don't know, whose boundaries you can't identify, whose desires have been so thoroughly suppressed that you're not sure they exist anymore. This is what Jung called the dark night of the soul. The moment when all your coping mechanisms stop working and you're forced to confront the void at the center of your constructed identity. Most psychological content will tell you this is the beginning of healing. They're wrong. This is the beginning of terror. The neuroscience of integration. Here's what actually happens when you begin the work of reclaiming yourself. Your nervous system fights you hard. Dr. Porges explains that when you begin to establish boundaries, when you start to say no, when you pull your attention back from others and direct it inward, your body interprets this as danger. Because for your entire life, hypervigilance and self-abandonment have kept you safe. Safety isn't the absence of threat. Safety is the familiar. And the familiar, for you, is dissolution into others. So when you try to individuate, your amygdala screams, your heart rate spikes. You get waves of panic that feel like death. Your mind generates catastrophic fantasies. Everyone will leave you. You'll be alone forever. You've made a terrible mistake. This is not evidence that you're doing it wrong. This is evidence that you rewire neural pathways that have been in place for decades. Dr. Rick Hanson's research on neuroplasticity shows that creating new neural patterns requires consistent, repeated experience of the new state, while simultaneously staying present to the discomfort of the old pattern dissolving. Translation: you have to learn to tolerate the feeling of being separate, of being unknown, of existing without constant external validation. And this feels, quite literally, like dying. Because in a sense, it is. The false self is dying. And no matter how much suffering it caused, it was familiar, it was you. Or so you thought. The alchemy of shadow integration. But here's where the real work begins, and where most therapeutic approaches fail the empath. It's not enough to set boundaries. It's not enough to practice self-care. These are band-aids on a wound that requires surgery. Jung understood that the path to wholeness requires confronting the shadow, the aspect of yourself you've exiled because they threatened your survival strategy. For the empath, the shadow contains everything you've deemed selfish: your rage at being you, your contempt for weak people who demand your strength, your capacity for coldness, your desire to be served instead of serving, your sexuality divorced from caretaking, your ambition untethered from others' needs, your right to exist without justification. These aspects haven't disappeared. They've been operating unconsciously, leaking out in passive aggression, sudden coldness, mysterious illnesses that force others to care for you, or attraction to people who embody the very qualities you've rejected in yourself. The narcissist you keep dating. They're your shadow. They have no problem prioritizing their needs. They feel no guilt about taking. They exist in the world as if they have inherent worth. You're not attracted to them despite these qualities. You're attracted to them because of these qualities. They're living the unlived life you've repressed. Shadow. Integration doesn't mean becoming narcissistic. It means reclaiming the healthy aspects of self-priority, assertiveness, and boundary keeping that you've conflated with narcissism. It means discovering that you can care about yourself and care about others, that these aren't opposites, that healthy adults do both simultaneously. The reconstruction of self, what emerges on the other side of this process, isn't the person you were before. It's someone you've never been. Neuroplastically, you're rewiring your default mode network, the brain's self-referential system. Instead of defining yourself through your relationships to others, you're building an internal locus of identity. Psychologically, you're completing the developmental task that was interrupted in childhood, separation, individuation. You're learning, perhaps for the first time, where you end and another person begins. Existentially, you're moving from what Sartre called bad faith, living according to external definitions, to authentic being, choosing yourself not as a role but as a sovereign subject. This is not comfortable. Authenticity never is. Because once you see clearly, once you understand the mechanisms that have been running you, you can never go back to unconscious participation. You can't unknow what you know. And this means you'll lose people. The relationships built on your self-abandonment cannot survive your self-reclamation. They weren't designed to. They were built on an implicit contract: you disappear, and in exchange you get to stay. When you breach that contract by existing fully, the relationship ends, not always literally, though often, but always energetically. The person who needed your hypervigilance will find it elsewhere. The person who relied on your inability to say no will move on. The person who loved your empathy but couldn't tolerate your boundaries will reframe you as selfish, cold, changed. And you'll have to let them. Love is a function of wholeness. What replaces the old pattern isn't what you expect. You thought becoming whole would make you less capable of love. You thought boundaries would close your heart. You thought choosing yourself would make you alone. You were wrong about all of it. What you discover is that you were never actually loving before. You were fusing, merging, dissolving, disappearing. That's not love. That's self-annihilation dressed up in spiritual language. Real love, the kind that nourishes both people, requires two intact selves. It requires the capacity to remain yourself while also opening to another. To feel deeply without losing your center. To care profoundly without abandoning your own needs. This is what Buddhist psychology calls dependent origination applied to relationship. Two complete individuals creating something together that neither could create alone, while remaining fundamentally separate. It's what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites, not the dissolution of boundaries, but the conscious choice to lower them temporarily while retaining the capacity to restore them. And it's what attachment researcher Sue Johnson describes as secure functioning. Two people who can be both autonomous and deeply connected, who can hold themselves in each other, who don't need to merge to feel safe. When you love from this place, from wholeness rather than woundedness, everything shifts. You stop attracting the emotionally unavailable because you're no longer available for that dynamic. Your nervous system literally doesn't respond to the intermittent reinforcement that used to feel like passion. You start attracting people who can meet you in your fullness, who aren't threatened by your complexity, who don't need you to be less so they can be more. And if they can't, you let them go. Not with drama, not with the old pain, but with the quiet clarity of someone who knows their worth isn't up for negotiation. The integrated empath, what you become, is something most people never achieve. Truly empathic being operating from groundedness rather than woundedness. Your sensitivity doesn't disappear, it deepens. But now it's filtered through discernment. You can feel what others feel without taking it on. You can hold space without losing yourself in it. You can love without needing to save. You can witness pain without absorbing it. This is what polyvagal theory calls flexible vagal tone. The ability to move fluidly between states of deep connection and healthy separateness, between open-heartedness and protective boundaries. It's what Gestalt therapy describes as contact and withdrawal, the rhythmic dance of meeting and returning to self that characterizes healthy relationship. It's what the mystics have always known, that you cannot truly give what you don't possess. That service without self-care is martyrdom. That the most powerful healing happens not through merger, but through resonance too. separate instruments playing in harmony. So this is where the chase ends. Not in finding the perfect person, not in finally being chosen, but in choosing yourself so completely that external validation becomes irrelevant. The love you were seeking was never out there. It was always an inside job, and the moment you stop running toward others and start running toward yourself, everything you actually need begins to arrive. Not because you're manifesting it, not because the universe rewards you, but because you finally become a vibrational match for what you actually deserve. Relationships built on mutuality, respect, and the recognition of two whole humans choosing each other freely. The empath awakens not by becoming less sensitive, but by becoming more sovereign, not by closing the heart, but by opening it from a foundation of self-possession. Not by learning to love less, but by learning to love from fullness instead of lack. And in that transformation, you discover what you were always meant to be, not a savior, not a healer, not a martyr, but a whole human being capable of profound connection without self-destruction. The journey from wound to wholeness is the most difficult path you'll ever walk. It's also the only one worth taking, because on the other side of it, you don't just survive, you finally, fully become